Dr. Paul Hedges took his undergraduate and postgraduate in Wales, University of Wales in Lampeter, and is presently Associate Professor in Interreligious Studies in Singapore, Nanyang Technological University. Before that, he was Reader in Interreligious Studies in the University of Winchester, which has an interesting program actually in religion, and has just recently, three months ago,
yes, 3 months ago,
moved to Singapore. Edited numerous volumes, including Christian approaches to other faiths, particularly pertinent here. Paul will speak for approximately 40 minutes.
Yes, around 40 minutes.
Perfect.
Yes.
And then he will have a response from Professor Loughlin, and then we will open it up to the floor. So with no further ado, we welcome you very much to Cambridge and to deliver this lecture on politics and the religions in the UK, interfaith dialogue, deliberative democracy and government.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you very much for the invitation here, both to the college and of course to the Woolf Institute and von Hügel Institute, and very much to Gorazd, who has very much sort of overseen the whole arrangements of me coming here to give this talk. Now, the paper I'm going to present is a fusion of two related but distinct papers and research projects I've been working on for a while. Also, it is a relatively new research area for me, which is the connection of politics, religious traditions, and interreligious dialogue, with most of my previous work being more historical and philosophical in nature. So, bringing this together, I'm going to sort of kind of range over a set of areas rather than sort of having a single consolidated argument, but I'm sure it will all come together in the end. So, I'll start off. I've got a PowerPoint. I'm not really relying upon this. This is more kind of to put some of my larger quotes on to make it easier for you, and also to give you some sense of where I am in the whole thing. So, given our increasingly multi-religious society, governments have over recent decades, but especially since 9/11 and 7/7, sought to find ways to bring religions into the arena of public life as stakeholders who can contribute to social harmony. This reflects the growing international prominence of religion in the public sphere, also often opposed by certain secularists who believe that religion should be relegated to the private sphere alone. This paper will address the way that different governments have employed interfaith dialogue as a tool to promote harmony, but focusing upon the efforts of New Labour, who I would argue have most directly tried to address the relationship between government, interfaith and social cohesion. And I will relate all of this to the idea of deliberative democracy and a question of how faith and interfaith may interact in the public sphere. So to briefly map out my paper for you, I will start with a brief discussion of some of the ways that government has engaged faith and interfaith, and then proceed to a more detailed discussion of one particular initiative, the 2008 New Labour document Face to Face and Side by Side, before introducing the concept of deliberative democracy. The final part of my paper will then discuss some of the ways that government engagement with faith and interfaith can be related to deliberative democracy, as well as addressing the role of religion and interfaith relations in the public sphere. So, in an oft-cited report for the Department of the Deputy Prime Minister, a group of British academics observed that discourse on what we may broadly term social diversity changed through the mid to late 20th century and into the 21st century, from the language and agenda of race to discussion of ethnicity and finally to religion. That report, issued in 2006, marked part of the government's attempts to understand the nature and extent of religious belonging and identity in the UK in the early part of this century, and resulted in a number of initiatives to engage with religious communities more effectively. To some extent, this agenda, under the New Labour administration, was not wholly novel. They had started to expand faith schools since coming to office in 1997, in particular, opening them up beyond Christianity. While earlier, in 1987, the Interfaith Network for the UK had been founded under a Conservative government. But it was only really post 9/11 that interfaith became an area of direct government interest on any major scale. a number of different reasons for the increased government interest have been raised, ranging from an awareness of a religiously inspired or related terrorism to the inclusion of the question of religion on the 2001 census, which of course made people aware of the constituencies which were out there, and also to personal faith commitments of a number of government ministers, including the Prime Minister. And of course, subsequently, Tony Blair has launched the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, which has been very involved in this. But certainly, the significance and prominence given to faith by New Labour was a new factor in British politics, partly indicated by increased funding available to faith communities. Now, a couple of sort of significant projects are perhaps noticeable. The first one is the Faith Communities Capacity Building Fund, established in 2006, which invested several £1 million into a number of communities, but it lacked a clear policy directive. So as I've mentioned, I'll focus on this 2008 document, Face to Face and Side by Side, from the Department for Communities and Local Government, which marked the most significant engagement of this government to try and actively promote social cohesion through faith and interfaith engagement. A detailed outline of the document and analysis of it goes beyond the scope of what I can do today, but I'll try and draw out some key aspects. However, it's worth mentioning that while this was a very significant document, it didn't become overly influential. Within 2 years, of course, Labour had lost the elections to the Conservative Party with our current coalition, and if you like, this document and the force behind it was lost. But it's not that faith and interfaith fell off the agenda. Rather, the Conservative-led coalition sought to use the Church of England as its main tool to engage religious communities in a programme called Near Neighbours. Using the existing charity organisation, the Church Urban Fund, and the Church of England's ongoing Presence and Engagement programme, it sought to funnel money into initiatives at the local level via this route. I will focus, though, on Face to Face and Side by Side, which is the most well-documented government programme, primarily through this text itself, which explains exactly how government wished to engage with faith and interfaith groups, with Near Neighbours largely bypassing government involvement simply by channeling money into an existing charity, even if it is a church-run one. And in this sense, I said it partly exemplifies David Cameron's much vaunted Big Society, which in large part has been seen by many as an attempt, I said, to hoist social welfare onto NGOs and other bodies with the removal of government funding with plans for austerity. So I would also mention that despite going through this route, Near Neighbours and Face to Face and Side by Side, as I will argue, have quite a sort of utilitarian sort of approach. Neither government seems particularly interested in fostering good interfaith relations as an end in itself. Rather, social cohesion, to which this may give some support, is about the avoidance of criminality, riot and disturbance. Of course, we shouldn't criticise the government for not promoting particular theological stances, which we wouldn't expect, but as I will sort of argue, it's a bit odd that when government tries to engage with faith communities, it seems to sideline the religious narrative to a large extent. So I turn now to Face and Side by Side. So in 2007, Hazel Blears, who was then the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, started a consultation which had this same name, Face to Face by Side, which took this title from some words by Jonathan Sacks, which you have up here. Dialogue, which leads to faith communities having a better understanding of one another, including celebrating the values held in common, as well as by acknowledging distinctiveness. Meanwhile, Side by Side relates to collaborative social action, including participation in local democracy, involving different faith communities and wider civil society, which brings about positive and concrete change within local communities. Now, clearly this agenda raises two central aspects of dialogue, one of which is often known as the dialogue of theological exchange, the other one, the dialogue of action. Now, as you may well know, these are part of what is a fairly standard fourfold typology for interfaith dialogue, which talks about the dialogue of theological exchange, which is theoretical and doctrinal discussion. Then there's the dialogue of life, which is the natural meeting people in society and day-to-day activities. The dialogue of action, so when people of faith meet each other for particular activist agendas, whether it be environmentalism or something else. And a dialogue of religious experience, which refers to acts of shared prayer or exchange of spiritual techniques and meditation practices. So within this, face-to-face and side-by-side, has, if you like, this theological dialogue and a dialogue of action as its two focuses. Now, as I've suggested, it does this for quite instrumental ends, which it actually spells out quite clearly. And again, I've got a very large quote up here, so I've put it up here for your benefit. I'll read it out. As interfaith dialogue and social action can help to build positive relations and break down barriers between people from different backgrounds, they clearly have a valuable role to play as part of wider efforts to build cohesion and resilience within communities to extremism in all its forms. So there, if you like, dialogue and social action are there as a means to an end. And in the second part, interfaith activity can also lead to greater community empowerment and civic engagement, as well as improvements in well-being and the creation of opportunities for people to realise their full potential through specific activities to tackle inequality and deprivation. The government believes that interfaith social action has a particularly valuable role to play. It provides practical opportunities for people from different backgrounds to work together side by side with a sense of shared endeavour. As such, I don't think the government was underhand in promoting interfaith dialogue and ulterior motive. It was quite upfront in outlining its agenda. It knew what interfaith activity could achieve and wanted to harness this more clearly and directly. However, this does mean that what government did moved away, if you like, from this clearly placed centre stage aspect of this Axis twofold model, and rather in the end, as government engaged it, there was one particular direction that they were actually interested in. Now, importantly, I'm not suggesting that dialogue is one type of activity and it can't have more activist-focused ends. As I've mentioned, we've got this fourfold typology with theological exchange, life, action and religious experience demonstrating this. And a Norwegian scholar, Oddbjørn Lervik, has spoken about dialogue as being for either spiritual or necessary ends. So we can do it like more theological dialogue, or we can do it simply because we need to live alongside each other, which is what the government is intending it. As such, I'm not suggesting that somehow government involvement has distracted interfaith dialogue from what it should really do, or some sort of pure form of it, but it does have one clear agenda which perhaps they weren't explicit in setting out when suggesting that they were going to focus upon these two aspects. Of course, all of this is complicated by some of the words here, and terms like religion and religious denote certain spheres as we're ordinarily used. Other ones like the secular and political are also used in other contexts, and they're deeply contested terms. And various scholars will of course suggest that actually we need to realise that they're not separate realms of life, as some people suggest. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the terminology here, because in the UK context, probably most people involved in this will have some sense of what the mainstream application is. So this dialogue which I have mentioned, taking place, as I've mentioned, is focused upon social cohesion, the common good, or some communal well-being, rather than, if you like, a specifically spiritual or religious agenda. But of course in dialogue generally, it's hard perhaps to know exactly what any person's reasons for doing it is. Now, I shall seek to show some aspects of this through a closer reading of a small part of Face-to-Faith and Side-by-Side. And the document mentions religion and belief numerous times, or in places just religion or faith, the latter seemingly preferred for talking about specific faiths, i.e. faith communities or interfaith groups, especially in its introduction, which lays out a lot of ground of what was discovered in the consultation. But over the course of the 132 pages, it is hard to find a single instance that actually spells out what it means by that. The closest is the following, and again the quote is up here. The major faiths all share the core belief in the value of positive social action, and faith-based organisations provide services, support and practical help to communities. Such generic phrasing is moreover not supported by reference to any teachings, scriptural sources or evidence base, but it's the closest to discussing any religious position that the document comes. Of course, scholars are notorious for picking up generalisations, and it may be supposed that had the document started making claims about what religions believe or stand for, I would have been making equally sort of sweeping sort of claims against them for their sweeping. That's badly phrased. I should read what I've got down here instead of making stuff up. So I'd be equally accusing them for rash or hasty and sweeping claims. Nevertheless, so for a document intended to engage faith communities, a failure to engage with any aspect of thought, doctrine, scripture or practice does seem strange. Rather, looking through the document, many mentions of the way that religion or faith is respected, or that religions or faiths are welcomed and encouraged abound, but nothing moves beyond these vague comments of intention or structures of support. So I'll mention one particular section to draw this out. Now, face-to-face, side-by-side tries to sort of move beyond simply making sort of warm-sounding gestures by setting out what it calls 4 building blocks for concrete action, and it can perhaps be applauded for this. Now, the 4 building blocks are these. So block 1, the confidence and skills to bridge and link. Building block 2, shared spaces for interaction. Building block 3, structures and processes which support dialogue and social action. And building block 4, opportunities for learning which build understanding. Now, I'm going to focus upon block 3, which is that intended to support dialogue and social action. So we may expect to see dialogue discussed here. Now, the document takes New Labour's usage of the concept of social capital as key. It speaks about associational structures as important in building bridges and linking social capital. Citing a Joseph Rowntree report foundation, faith as social capital, linking and dividing. And if you don't know, social capital is basically about the way that a community, often sort of sidelined from the public agenda, can engage, if you like, with the broader society, but also with government structures as well. So sort of perhaps immigrant communities, they don't speak very much English. How do you get them to engage, if you like, with the structures of government and the welfare support that's out there? And this section mentions various groups which may be significant in linking different communities, one of which is the Interfaith Network for the UK, and others it suggests can provide an important leadership role, citing the Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board as one example, and goes on to mention several others and gives brief case studies. Really, these are just very brief descriptive accounts, and it's just normally 3 or 4 sentences, so it's not really a developed case study, as we might understand it in its opening section. It then goes on to discuss the way that local and national government can be linked to, and moreover, the way that local groups exist which can help, and again it gives a list of different groups. So there's the London Local Authorities Faith and Community Cohesion Group, or the regional development agencies which are suggested, and again brief and very descriptive case studies are interspersed in the text. Now, referring to its consultation document, face-to-face and side-by-side notes that the strategy needed to be a framework for everyday life with multiple and appropriate opportunities or pathways for local people within local communities to take part in dialogue and social action is what it's doing. And again, very brief case studies are given. One example is an adventure play group which took children to different mosques, synagogues and churches in London. And another one was a North East England project that set out, we're told, to celebrate faith and cultural diversity. But perhaps trying to emphasise that there is not a single prescriptive way of doing this, or a one-size-fits-all approach. So I said none of the case studies give any details of what actually happened. We don't know what events these were. So how faith was celebrated or how cultural diversity was enhanced, we have absolutely no idea. Basically, it's kind of a list of activities or a list of names that we're getting here, rather than any sort of idea as to how communities can go about engaging. The final part of this section of face-to-face and side-by-side, and I should note that these divisions are mainly my own rather than those of the document, focuses upon local authorities. The reason for this focus is stated in the following, in quite a large quote here which I've got up here for you. So at the heart of the government's approach to cohesion is the principle that cohesion is something that can only be understood and built locally. This is because levels of cohesion in an area depend upon a series of interacting factors, the characteristics and history of an area, residents' personal characteristics, and residents' attitudes. We also know that there is no single or small group of factors which can explain the level of cohesion in an area. Even the strongest influence, the level of deprivation, can only explain a few percentage points difference. This complexity of influences on cohesion means that improving cohesion is about addressing multiple issues at the same time. So clearly it sort of shows that it is a very difficult sort of subject. There's no simple answer to it, and as it is perhaps important for doing that. However, considering how interfaith may contribute towards a deliberative public space brings us into complicated territory. Dialogue remains problematic because there are those within religious organisations and communities who will see it as watering down specific commitments to one tradition. There is for some a fear of speaking a single common language in the public sphere, which will imply losing the specificity of their tradition, or suggesting that religions share the most important common truths together. Notwithstanding some who would promote such a discourse, interreligious dialogue and engagement may therefore seem by some to be a problematic venture for their traditions. Another issue is the way that interreligious dialogue, particularly as practiced by the government, tends to be representative of only certain views and religions. For instance, the Interfaith Network of the UK has a list of recognised religions, and a number of local interreligious organisations limit participation to these groups. And in another context, the sociologist Sophie Gilliatt-Ray has argued that government representation has highlighted the way that the major world religions are emphasised against what she suggested growing trends in spirituality or the New Age. And certainly within the interreligious scene, it is very rare that pagan communities would find themselves represented or even invited to the table. Interfaith dialogue does not therefore just open up an equal space, but privileges certain voices. Also, interreligious battles are played out in this arena, with groups seen as heterodox or dominant, or majoritarian religious communities finding themselves excluded or included on this basis. So in the UK, this tends to mean that interfaith tends to be Anglican or Catholic, or both, for the Christian camp, Sunni from the Muslim camp, and Khalsa from the Sikh camp, to take 3 examples. And other representatives, for instance Mormons, Sufis or non-Khalsa voices, tend not to be included within the interfaith sphere. Meanwhile, certain minority religions may not be represented particularly well, according to some, and so Kagake is perhaps one example. As a Buddhist organisation, it's very significant in a lot of interfaith work in the UK, but as an offshoot of the sectarian Japanese tradition, is far from representative of Buddhism as a whole, or even the broader Mahayana trends. So certainly like sort of subgroupings are often sort of overrepresented, while again sometimes certain majority groups are represented to the exclusion of other minority groups. Another aspect around representation relates to gender. Much publicly visible and high-profile dialogue occurs within what has been termed a parliamentary style of representative dialogue, where high-level leaders will meet to discuss. And given the patriarchal structures of most religious communities, this means it tends to be a case of men talking to men. And of course we have 3 men at the front here. I don't know if that has any significance in this. And of course it's normally older elite males. And indeed some women activists have reported that their own co-religionists have sought to bar them from dialogue sessions on the grounds it's going to upset the other community they may be speaking to. while I said the leaders will often sort of represent particular sort of elite traditions with a certain conformity emphasised at the expense of what may be the lived or actual practice of the religion. Also, interfaith dialogue may sometimes be promoted as an almost idealistic solution to getting religious meeting and harmony within the public sphere, and so presumably an avenue for deliberation, and this is presumably why government has seen it as a resource to use. As I've mentioned, it can be extremely problematic. However, I'd suggest that this is not the whole picture, and certainly we need to be wary of language suggesting that there is a realm of dialogue, I said, about sort of religious agreement on essentials, and dialogue will take place in many areas. And certainly, the priest and interfaith activist Ray Gaston provides some detailed case studies of joint activism between Christian, Muslim and secular individuals against the English Defence League. And as he shows, local communities of diverse makeup could be united around the defence of what they come to call our mosques. So I'm not suggesting, if you like, that interfaith dialogue is itself a problem. There aren't any good examples of the way it can work and the way government wanted it to. But certainly, I said, it's not a general sort of panacea. Finally, one thing I haven't mentioned, which haunts this discussion, is whether religion has a legitimate space within the public sphere. And just as one criticism of Habermas in seeking to include religion was it denied properly religious voice, an equally strong criticism is that basically faith should have no place, that it's irrational, faith-based, old-fashioned, and therefore should be taken out of the public sphere. There's a lot more I could say about that, and actually a lot more in this paper, but I will skip over that, as I'm aware I've probably had most of my 40 minutes so far. So I will move to my conclusion. So to conclude, I've ranged across quite a few issues within this paper, but the main points I believe I have raised are the following. First, that governments have started to engage faith and interfaith more seriously as matters of policy and as concern behind social cohesion, with perhaps New Labour being more engaged in this than anybody else. Secondly, exemplified through face-to-face and side-by-side, it can be seen that government engagement tends to approach a utilitarian agenda that sidelines any explicitly religious narrative. Third, I would suggest that deliberative democracy provides a tool that is useful in mapping government engagement, even if there are some tensions and issues raised, notably, I said, the normative issue of what role faith should have within public reasoning. And fourth, I hope I've shown that while government has highlighted interfaith dialogue as a way to promote a deliberative public sphere, but not using deliberation theory itself, there are problems with seeing it as a simple and straightforward answer to this problem. However, I wouldn't rule it out, and certainly I think it may well be an option that could be used very well to increase social cohesion and perhaps a greater deliberative public sphere. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed. And I'd like first to thank Ed and Gorazd for inviting me to participate in this event. I think it's very positive that the Von Hügel Institute and the Woolf Institute are running something together. Although we both belong to the same college, it's the first time we've done it, so I think it's a very good initiative. And I'd like to thank Paul for his paper, which I have read the copy which he sent, which is more or less what he's just read now. So I'd like just to make 4 comments about the paper and some of the issues you raise in it, without getting into a lot of the details, and then just finish up with a couple of conclusions. And the first comment is, well, I think the background to the paper, what made the paper possible, is the affirmation that religion has not disappeared from our Western societies, as was predicted by the secularization thesis of the 1960s. This thesis predicted the demise of religion, and particularly in Western Europe, there is still some adherence to the secularization thesis, like Steve Bruce, and I think even in a country like Britain, which is supposed to be highly secularized, religion is still present and is still on the agenda, and I think that's a useful insight that has come out of your paper. And religion, in some sense of the word, and I agree it's difficult to pin down the meaning, there's many phenomena that we classify under religion. And Buddhism, for example, is it really a religion? And so there's all those questions. But religion, in some sense of the word, is still with us very strongly. Whether we regard this as a good or a bad thing, it's possible to acknowledge this fact and think this is a great misfortune. So many of the secularization thesis people think this is not so good. And I think it's interesting to look at the last two censuses, 2001, 2011, which showed that a majority of UK residents ticked the Christian box. This, I think the 2001 census was the first time the question was asked in a census, what is your religion? They gave a number of options. Something like 71% in 2001 ticked Christian. What they mean by that is another question, but nevertheless it's an interesting self-identification. 2011 it was a bit less. It went down to 59.5%, and between the two censuses the British Human Association had a big campaign to try to persuade people not to tick that box. They were trying to say we don't want this idea that Britain is still a religious society. And we can add to the Christian, those who take the Christian box, representative Muslim, Sikh and Jewish minorities and other religions. So that can cover quite a lot as well. And I think that's actually quite interesting, because when you look at the figures of the 2011 census, it's only 25% declared they had no religion. That's a quarter of the population. And that doesn't mean they're atheists, by the way. It means they don't adhere to a religion. And many of them may be religious in some sense, but they just simply don't belong to any particular religion. So the figures were 25% no religion, 7.2% didn't answer the question. So there may be some non-religious people in that, but may not. And the rest declared adherence to some kind of a religion. 59.5% Christian, as I said, 4.4% to Islam, 1.3% to Hinduism, and 1.9% to other religions. So if you add them up, that means 67.1% of the UK population in 2011 declared adhesion to a religion in some sense of the word. And I think that's really quite significant. And it's a message that I think we need to get across, that religion is here and religion is important, and the majority of our population have some relationship to it. Doesn't mean intensive religious practice, which is another question, and which is how sociologists tend to define religion is by numbers going to church every Sunday or questions like this. But the different religious groups have different practices in that regard. And a Catholic, which is what I am, when I was growing up, it was thought to be a mortal sin if you didn't go to Mass on Sunday. So where I grew up in Ireland, in Belfast, something like 95% people went to Mass every Sunday. I was amused by an Irish Times headline about 1990 which said, only 80% of the population going to Mass on Sunday. So kind of relative. And today it's actually still above half the population aren't go to church every Sunday. Nevertheless, I think even if it doesn't mean that kind of religious practice, the numbers of those attending places of worship regularly is probably greater than the number of people attending football matches at the weekend in Britain. So religion is a phenomenon that needs to be taken into account. And I think this is probably what's behind the Labour government and the Conservative government, to some extent, dealing with the issue. So governments must therefore recognize this phenomenon of religion if they are to devise policies applicable to the whole of society. And I think this is what Paul's paper is examining, mainly by looking at the last Labour government's attempt to promote interfaith dialogue in order to promote social cohesion. And I agree with his analysis of that document in that the government's approach is based on an almost entirely utilitarian approach to religion that almost totally ignored the substantive content of what people actually believed. And it was, I would say, almost like a cynical attempt to bring in religion. I'm slightly less positive towards the New Labour approach to religious communities as a Catholic, because I think, you know, they did force the Catholic adoption agencies to close down because of their refusal to hand children over to homosexual couples. And there was an attempt to, I think, really undermine the religious ethos of faith schools by imposing a 25% quota of non-believers as a condition for funding of the school. And Alan Johnson was the main pusher of that. We'll come to that in a moment. But I think it is interesting that a government like the Labour government and the current Conservative government will recognise that religious groups exist, and they will try to enlist them in their different policy programmes. You did mention in your paper the big society of the Conservatives, and rather dismissed that as an excuse for cuts. I've actually written a book about this. And I think the big society idea in its origins actually predated the crisis, the 2008 crisis. So I don't think it was simply a case of as an excuse for cuts, but I think there was actually a bit more to it. I don't think it ever really developed fully, but I think it was actually quite a good initiative in many ways that was quite sincere. Okay, so that's my second comment is that religion must be taken into account by governments in their policy making. Now, I think actually there is an implicit theory in the Labour government and the current Conservative government and most Western governments, and I think the implicit theory I would call Rawlsianism. It's an approach to public life that was defined really by John Rawls, which I think you could mention in the paper a bit more fully. And basically, as most of you know, Rawls thought that entry into the public square was conditional on adopting a position of public reason. And public reason was incompatible with comprehensive doctrines, such as are held by religious groups. Therefore, the place of religious groups was the private sphere. So if you entered the public square, as Americans call it, the public sphere, as Habermas calls it, you leave your religious beliefs behind you. I think there's something like that in the Labour government's approach, actually, even though they don't always implicitly acknowledge it. And that'll explain some of the reasons why they don't engage in the doctrinal aspects of the religious groups they're trying to enlist. And Raymond Plant, Lord Plant, who's a political philosopher, a member of the House of Lords, remarked in a book about a couple of years ago that the secularist liberals will accept religion only if it adapts to the reigning secular orthodoxy, I think particularly on issues of sexual ethics. So the condition of you entering the public square is you become something like a secular liberal, and your strange beliefs about sexuality, etc., you must leave behind you. And that's a very Rawlsian kind of approach. A recent example, perhaps, was Hillary Clinton's very recent statement just a few days ago that religious groups will have to change their doctrines in order to accept abortion. So if you hold a tradition teaching of abortion, you must change that in order to be acceptable to the political elites of that time. Okay, so let's make it to comment 4, which is about deliberative democracy. And I think it is very, very good that you try to really relate this issue to democracy, because this is, to me, a key issue in how religious groups really relate to modern Western pluralistic societies. It also raises the question of what we mean by democracy, because that's a term, again, that can be unpacked in different models of democracy. And I think democracy can actually develop along interesting lines, and religious groups can contribute to that development. And I think it's an interesting line that we could perhaps follow up. Now, Rowan Williams, it also raises the issue I'd like to bring in, which you say you didn't really tackle, of secularism, because I think sort of in the background here is the secular state, secularism, and democracy, because I think liberal represent democracy, is very much tied up with the liberal democratic nation state, and they go together actually historically. And religious groups have, to some extent, have to define their position in relation to those two related phenomena. So I think secularism is important. We need to look at it. Now, Rowan Williams makes a useful distinction between what he calls programmatic secularism and procedural secularism. I think it's very, very useful. So programmatic secularism is a secularism of la tradition laïque in France, or the British Humanist Association, or the National Secular Society, or many people in the Labour Party, and the Lib Dems, and now increasingly the Conservatives, who adopt that Rawlsian position of exclusion of all religious expressions and presence from the public square. Obviously, Rowan Williams rejects that, but he says there's another kind of secularism which we can actually accept much more fully, which is procedural secularism. And basically what that means, I think, is that the secular state, which is the sine qua non state of a liberal representative democracy, cannot accept the domination of any particular religious group. So it's the opposite of the established established churches, etc., that are linked to our modern history. I think perhaps the American separation of church and state is a good example of procedural secularism that works quite well, I think, there. Now, I would say not only should the secular state not accept any religious group that is dominant, but it should also not accept programmatic secularism, which I regard as an ideology. It should not be a dominant ideology. And this is a big problem in many of our Western societies, this type of secularism, programmatic secularism has become the dominant, has been a new church, in fact, a new established church, which is a certain kind of philosophical approach, which is no more right to dominance than a religious group, actually, in my opinion. And so we actually need to make that clear. Habermas too, I think held that position, but now he's evolved a bit. But even Habermas's position, as I think you brought up in your paper, would say that religious groups have a right of place in the public sphere, provided they argue in terms of secular reason, so that we have to adapt to them, but they don't have to adapt to us. And this is something Pope Benedict, for example, in his dialogue with Habermas in Munich, challenged this idea. And it means then that something is lost of the rich tradition of religious thought from religious communities, and a very honourable tradition as well. So I'd like to just conclude these remarks by invoking the work of another political scientist. Well, in fact, there were two, but mainly associated with one person, is Alfred Stepan, S-T-E-P-A-N, who works in Columbia University in New York, and Juan Linz is Spanish political scientist. And they advance what they call the twin toleration thesis. And it's explicitly challenging the Rawlsian position and the dominance of Rawlsianism in our approaches to these issues. Now, what they did a big study across the world to see whether religion and democracy are compatible. And they looked at countries like India, for example, and Indonesia, and the United States, and various European countries like Poland. Their conclusion was that, in fact, they are quite compatible, but you have to, think through the relationship between the two phenomena, and they call this the twin toleration thesis. So that means the secular state must accept religious groups as being part of a public sphere, not necessarily the political sphere, and I think that's a useful distinction between the political sphere and a public sphere, or a public square. And they must be recognized as such. So a country like India, for example, which is the world's largest democracy, recognizes the major faiths in things like public holidays and schools and in many other ways, and it works. And that includes Islam, includes Hindus, includes Buddhists, includes Christians, etc. And other countries in the world show that as well. Now, the twin toleration is that religious groups must also accept the secular state. And Stepan talks about the multivocality of religious groups. I think you bring that in your paper as well, that simple phenomena, but they're actually composed of a variety of positions. And Linz and Stepan would argue that if you adopt the Rawlsian approach, it actually harms democracy, because what you do is you force these groups into marginalization. This will encourage those parts of the group of the religious communities that are most opposed to democracy. And by doing that, you actually endanger democracy itself. But by giving them this recognition, and on their part, they're accepting of the rules of procedural secularism, then the more, if you like, the more moderate voices or the less extreme voices, the more pro-democratic voices will also be strengthened. And therefore, by adopting that approach, then you actually strengthen democracy. And just very finally, I do think there's a rich tradition in all of our religious traditions. You know, you see it, Jonathan Sacks' Judaism, Rowan Williams' Anglicanism, the great tradition of Catholic social thought. Someone like Pope Benedict actually deserves to be read much more, I think, but now put it in practice by Pope Francis. And those traditions must be actually brought in explicitly into our public life as a way of enrichment. So Rawlsian secularism, at least the early Rawls rather than the later Rawls changed his mind a little bit towards the end, is an impoverishment of our societies. And so I think, to me, it's something I don't think many politicians understand today, actually, because they do deal in, we live in a very superficial world, actually. And it strikes me the average politician seems incapable, really, of understanding some of these issues, even if they pay lip service to them sometimes. You know, but anyway, I'll leave it there. And thank you for
sure. Well, let's. I'm sure you've got lots of things to respond to, but let's just open it up for comments or questions from the floor. Anyone like to get raised?